Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domini. Okay, we saw the miracle of the end of the plague with St. Gregory the Great. How did the plague end? Anybody?
It ended with the people praying litanies. And
Louder.
It ended with the people praying litanies, and then once they made it to the Church of Saint Mary Major, they all saw Saint Michael the Archangel appear, and he sheathed his sword.
Yeah, that was above the Hadrian's Castle, which is still standing today, and there's a big statue of Saint Michael there. All right, let's pick up where we left off. Cities were overthrown, camps uprooted, churches destroyed by the barbarians. No farmer inhabits our land. Upon us who are left, and very few indeed we are, the sword of man rages incessantly with the scourges of punishment from on high. Thus we behold the evils of the world, which in former times we used to hear were to come, unfolding before us like pages of books, and in the form of the identical plagues of the whole earth. In the passing away, therefore, of all things, we ought to think that what we have loved was nothing. Look, therefore, with a solicitous mind upon the approaching day of the eternal Judge, and by penance forestall its terror. Even the church seemed to him, to St. Gregory, to be in that decayed state, suggesting the horrible possibility held forth by Christ in the stem and wistful question, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? St. Luke chapter 18, verse 8. Wherever he looked, he saw palace bishops. Palace bishops. What's that mean? Anthony, what's a palace bishop?
Palace bishop? A worldly bishop?
Yeah, bishops who are not interested really to sacrifice for souls, preach the faith, uproot heresy. They want to live a delicate life in their palace. Kind of a selfish life, which is the danger of many bishops. So in England, in the 1500s, when King Henry forced on England the new religion, did all the bishops stand up and protest?
No, just
No.
one.
Did all the bishops go along with him?
Yes.
All except
St. John Fisher.
only one stood up. So those are palace bishops. They're not really interested in the faith and the glory of God and souls. They're in it for themselves. They're in it for their comfort. They're in it for whatever worldly gain they can get, or prestige, or fear of being made fun of. Even peer pressure can affect bishops, right? So palace bishops sounds familiar, doesn't it? So wherever he looked, St. Gregory the Great saw palace bishops, lax priests. So priests who are also not preaching the faith, not sacrificing for the sheep, not teaching the catechism, lazy in giving the sacraments, maybe even scandalous lives. And very often it has to do with mistresses. Catholics who were Catholics in name only. So it sounds familiar to our time, doesn't it? Simony, the purchase of church offices with money, had become an almost universal evil. It was a common thing in Gaul, France, for bishops to accept bribes for ordaining priests. St. Gregory writes this in Book 11, Epistle 55. And I have to say, this is like the Tuke bishops. All these Tuke line bishops, there's a truth about that. You got a bishop in every garage. Some of these two-line bishops will ordain anything for a bribe. The Bishop of Marseille in France had wicked intimates. The East was even worse than the West. It has come to our ears, wrote St. Gregory, that in the churches of the East, no one attains to sacred orders without giving bribes. Bishops quarreled with other bishops or with monasteries. Africa was kept in a perpetual state of conflict by the oppressions of pagan rulers and Donatist church-burning heretics. So you're getting an idea of what the world was like in the time of St. Gregory. It wasn't all that great. You have the barbarian invasions, you got heresies, you got lax priests, scandalous or lazy bishops, palace bishops. The East, always at friction with the West. Spain was the only country which gave the new Pope, St. Gregory, some cause for rejoicing. Leander had accomplished wonders there since his return. That's St. Leander, the bishop. Remember him?
Yes.
St. Leander. He had boldly opposed the persecuting Visigoth king Leovigild, even to the extent of converting his son. So, Saint Leander opposed King Leovigild. Or Leovigild, whichever one is pronounced, even to the extent of converting his son. Anybody guess who his son might be? Any wild guesses? Hermenegild.
He's the one that his father was an Arian, and he threw his son into prison, right? And then
Yes.
his own father ended up murdering him.
And his father sent an Arian priest to bring him Holy Communion. And what did St. Hermenegild do?
He refused to receive Holy Communion from a heretical priest.
That's right. He refused communion while in prison from a heretical priest. So no wonder Archbishop Lefebvre said, stay away from the new Mass. Don't go to its sacraments. These priests are modernists, and you don't even know if it's valid. You don't even know if the bishop's ordinations or consecrations are even valid. The king, Leovigild, retorted by casting the young Hermenegild into prison, and there had him murdered by refusing to take communion, and had him murdered, or martyred, he's considered a martyr of the church, for refusing to take Holy Communion from an Arian bishop. On his deathbed in 589, he repented of this crime and begged St. Leander to receive his other son and heir, Ricared, into the Catholic Church. So his other son, Ricared. So St. Leovigild had a change of heart before he died. Thank God. Probably was the fruit of the martyrdom of his own son. Thus began the slow but steady return of the Spanish people to the true Catholic Church. And in the year 589, the year before St. Gregory's accession to the throne of Peter, St. Leander assembled 72 bishops in the memorable Third Council of Toledo in Spain, whose canons gave assurance of the glories of Catholic Spain, including those principles of representative government and limited monarchy, which originated there and thence spread throughout the world. In comparison to this, however, the darkness that had spread over Europe and Asia seemed all the blacker by contrast. St. Gregory the Great writes, "Call me Mara, for I am full of bitterness." He's quoting Ruth, chapter 1, verse 20. "I am come into the depths of the sea, and the storm has overwhelmed me." Psalm 68, verse 3. Wrote St. Gregory as he bent to his mighty task. He began it, however, after the manner of all the saints. None of these aspired at first to the vast influence they finally attained. The attempt to impose patterns upon mankind has always been rather the sentimental illusion of the children of this world and their prince. It was Alexander who wanted new worlds to conquer, Caesar who conceived of himself as the polar star of humanity, Muhammad who decided to make all men give up wine. On the other hand, St. Gregory, calling himself a worthless ape, or monkey, and signing himself the servant of the servants of God. Servus servorum Dei. He was the first pope to do this regularly. St. Damasus, however, had used the phrase before him. In a footnote. So, Servus servorum Dei. What's the subject?
Servus.
And what case are these, Michael?
Genitive.
Yes, that's right. Servant of the servants of God. Say it in Latin.
Servus servorum Dei.
Commenced, on the other hand, St. Gregory, calling himself a worthless ape and signing himself servant of the servants of God, commenced as all the saints had begun. St. Paul in the Arabian desert, St. Athanasius in the Thebaid desert with the monks, with the chastisement and correction of himself. He already had gone far in the painful process when he went to live at the Lateran. Only occasionally does any note of asperity ruffle the placid prose of his 14 volumes of letters. And then perhaps on days when a crescent gout was nipping most cruelly at his tired nerves. There was little in him of the keen irascibility of St. Athanasius, the sly irony and quick anger of St. Patrick, the nervous energy of the great Saint Leo. All his writings suggest rather the Olympian calm that was the secret of Holy Benedict. The pax, so evident even to this day in the Benedictine life. Pax means what?
Peace.
Yes, pax. So that's one of the mottos of the Benedictines, pax. St. Gregory, too, was patient, courteous, tactful, understanding, now and then quaintly humorous, always kind, a living example of the precepts he taught in that pastoral rule, which was to be the guidebook of popes and bishops for centuries to come. So this book, you will probably want to read it at some point in your seminary training. Pastoral Rule by St. Gregory the Great. It's very wise, very wise. He often says, for example, the priest must be active and busy and give the sacraments and teach. But he also has to contemplate and pray and retire from being around people, be alone with God in the Blessed Sacrament. So he always does this. He says, don't be excessively active, nor must a priest be a contemplative like a monk and neglect the sick and neglect teaching. So he has to have a balance of both. So that's an example of how he approaches many of the virtues. In the pastoral rule. A bishop must be a pattern to his people, he wrote. He must be chaste, charitable, humble, a man of prayer, a father to his flock. So a bishop must talk to his faithful. So it's really strange when you get some of these traditional bishops saying, I'll come and visit your parish or your oratory, but I don't want to be questioned by the faithful. Well, why not? Can't they talk to their father? The Lateran during this pontificate was more like a monastery than a palace. And that's true. At the Lateran, you often have the structure of the churches is like this. You have the huge church, the Lateran Church of St. John, and then you have connected to it the cloister, and then the monastery where they live in cells. So you always have the union of the active and the contemplative life, even in the construction. Durham is like that. Durham Cathedral in England and York, always attached to the big parish cathedral or abbey or basilica, is attached to the monastery. So Archbishop Lefebvre, being in an emergency mode now in this crisis of the church, his equivalent is the priory. The priests live in a priory, and they're to be men of prayer and live in common, in study and parish activities. At the outset, St. Gregory swept out of the Lateran all the lay politicians and parasites and replaced them with clerics. He brought monks from St. Andrew's monastery to live with him and had the abbot Maximinus and the majestic prior Augustine lay out a routine very similar to the one they had followed in the monastery. They worked, studied, prayed in common, meditated in silence, sang the sacred liturgy, preached, and wrote just as monks did everywhere else. So that's the seminary rule, isn't it? Very close to it. And that's the life of a priest. Work, study, pray in common, meditate in silence, sing the sacred psalms, the liturgy, preach, and take care of the sick and the dying, marriages, first communions, etc. St. Gregory probably spent a fixed time every day at his desk, for he was methodical in all things. He was well read and could have written elegantly had he considered it worth the trouble. But entertainment of his fellow men was no part of his program. Like the more brilliant St. Athanasius, he wrote only to teach the truth. And his colloquial, often homely Latin, the idiom of his own time, was the best instrument for this. In fact, St. Gregory deliberately avoided any effort at literary expression. The more leaves a tree has, he said dryly, the less fruit it bears. That's a wise saying, isn't it? The more leaves a tree has, the less fruit it bears. So in other words, don't be too wordy. Don't be too wordy. If you ever read, like Father Faber, his writings, any of you ever read Father Frederick Faber's writings?
I've read a little bit.
Yeah, so he's very flowery in his writing, very expressive, because it very appeals to the imagination. But I always found, he's great, but I always found him very wordy. Lots of words. Well, St. Gregory thought it better to Avoid literary expression and exaggeration. Keep simple. It bears more fruit. Yet the inspired wisdom of his Moralia, an enormous work interpreting almost every phase of the book of Job, has nourished the souls of such sublime saints as St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, and St. Teresa of Avila. They read his other works called Moralia, which is on Job, the book of Job. His letters often have the grandeur and beauty that is found only in the writings of the prophets of Israel and the vicars of Christ. His dialogues, which he wrote to console himself, he said, for his exile from St. Andrew's Monastery, is full of quaint marvels, profound discussions, and beautiful stories of great men who, achieving perfection by leaving the world, reminded the humble Pope of his own imperfection. So that's his famous dialogues. And in the dialogues is where you have the life of St. Benedict. From this monastic seclusion, paradoxically, the mind of St. Gregory looked forth to dominate Rome, Italy, and a large portion of the world. He became virtually governor of the city simply because there was no one else capable of ruling it, and because it was not in him to disappoint the hopes of the people who looked to his love and devotion for guidance. He organized their defense in time of war. He engaged mercenaries to protect the walls, encouraged the Romans to defend their own homes. He fed the whole population during many years of scarcity with corn he had brought on ships from the papal estates in Sicily. Nor was he likely to neglect the souls of his children in caring for their bodies. He established the processions to various holy stations which were maintained until modern times, like the 7 basilicas, the 7 churches in Rome, a very famous ancient pilgrimage. He built or repaired churches and monasteries, and since the most beautiful spiritual and fitting music for liturgical use was the plain chant, the Gregorian chant, as we now call it, he established schools in Rome for the teaching of it that became so famous that it spread throughout the world until Pope Pius X made it the official music of the Catholic Church. Nothing was too difficult or too small for the administrative genius that gradually disclosed itself in this Pope, as he went about with his pallium of plain white wool, a pectoral cross of thin silver hanging from his neck on a piece of cheap cloth. The Bishop of Rome had always been considered the father of Christians all over the world, and St. Gregory took this obligation as seriously as any of his great predecessors had, knowing the austerity of Christ towards unbelief, and his prayer at the Last Supper that the Church always be one. St. John 18, verse 20. He proceeded with great vigor against heresy and schism, against the Donatists in Africa, against the Arians and Monophysites, and against the rebellious bishops of Istria, whom he begged to return to the waiting arms of their mother, the Catholic Church. That's quoted in Mean Patrology. Second book, Epistle 51. And so he battled heresy. This is what we need in the See of Peter right now. Popes who will condemn heresy, condemn error, preach the faith. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Instead of promoting error and immorality. And because the church founded by the Holy One of God is and must be holy, he relentlessly attacked corruption, immorality, and laxity of discipline wherever they appeared. When Bishop Felix of Messina, for example, sent him some rich vestments as a gift, St. Gregory sold them and returned the proceeds with a tactful reminder of the judgment to come and an admonition to send me no more presents. First Epistle 66. He insisted upon a celibate clergy, but ordered that subdeacons already married keep their wives, since it would be manifestly unjust to separate them. He suspended Bishop Andrew of Taranto, Taranto, for having a woman. So a bishop having a girlfriend, probably his concubine. Saint Gregory had this bishop beaten and for ill-treating his clergy. From Bishop Leo of Syracuse, of whom sinister rumors had been circulated, he exacted a solemn oath over the body of St. Peter, and then, convinced of his innocence, commanded that he be received with all charity by the other bishops. So on one hand, he punishes guilty bishops. On the other hand, he defends the innocence of falsely accused bishops. So that's a lot to handle. Some of the most interesting of St. Gregory's letters were written to his man of business, Peter the subdeacon, whom he sent to look after the papal estates in Sicily. Generally, he addressed him in the tone of an affectionate but watchful and exacting employer, for whose attention no detail was too small. A certain Marcellus, who had had penance assigned to him in a monastery of St. Adrian, lacked food and clothing. Let your activity see that he get both, he writes. Some wandering monks scattered by the barbarians must be placed under a bishop in a monastery. There was danger of famine in Rome. Let Peter the subdeacon lay up 50 gold pounds worth of corn, where it would not rot, and ships would be sent for it in February. Though if none were available at Rome, Peter must find them. And let him remember now, before the most sacred body of the blessed Apostle Peter, he had received power over his patrimony. St. Gregory heard that a church at Villa Nova had wrongfully taken a farm from some nuns. If this was so, let it be restored. He was told that there were many old sterile cows on some of the church lands. St. Peter should disperse the herds these belonged to, distributing to the farmers 400 young cows for breeding. Let him persuade the prefect Romanus to be kinder to the peasants. He must protect a widow wronged by Deus Dedit. Let him give 20 decimates of wine and 4 solidi a year to the former judge Sosimus, who was in need. St. Gregory often checked up on Peter's activities through other agents in Sicily. Now and then he pulled up with a sharp word of censure or a bit of devastating irony. The Pope felt compunction for having allowed himself to be prejudiced against a servant of God named Preciosus. He writes, I drove him from me, sad and embittered, and his bishop would not send him back. Do you, therefore, if you have greater wisdom in your little puny body, attend to this matter so that my will may be done and the Lord Bishop not offended, he writes. Once he sent Peter the subdeacon 300 solidi, I guess that's the money of the time, to distribute among the needy, adding, don't leave the groans of the poor behind you there. The dying wishes of the wife of Redemptus, who left a silver dish to be sold for a certain monastery, must be carried out. Quote, lest beginning with trifles we be led on to greater sins. The Praetorian monastery was not yet finished, and for this, added the Pope sarcastically, what else do we praise but the fervor of your experience? Let this admonition arouse you. He was even more severe when he heard that certain property belonging to others had been found on the papal farms, and that Peter, the subdeacon, had neglected under pressure from guilty persons to have it restored to the rightful owners. If you are really a Christian, you will fear the justice of God more than the voices of men. Notice that I constantly admonish you about this. If you neglect to do it, he wrote, you shall have my voice also against you in testimony. This was the letter in which St. Gregory complained whimsically that, quote, you have sent us one worthless horse and 5 good asses. I cannot ride the horse because he is worthless, and I can't ride the good beasts because they are asses. But we beg that if you are disposed to hold us up, you send us another suitable one. And that's quoted here in Latin, Epistle 32. Another frequent correspondent of St. Gregory's during his whole pontificate was Archbishop Januarius of Cagliari in Sardinia, Italy, whose worst qualities, negligence, greed, and cruelty, seem to have grown upon him with old age. St. Gregory dispatched a notary from Rome to investigate such a mass of complaints against him that he hesitated to believe them. Bishops ought to be fathers to their flocks. Januarius should protect the good woman Catella from those who were persecuting her and help the religious Pompeiana. He had excommunicated and anathematized, quote, the most distinguished Isidore for no reason, except for a grudge for some personal injury. Let him be more careful and circumspect in the future, and presume not to inflict any such penalty again for redress of your own wrongs. Close quote. So this is an insight into many of his letters and what he has to deal with as a pope. So he's dealing with trifling things and big things. Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.